Hello, everyone. I am Ana Nieto. I'm the head of the Species Conservation Action Team here at IUCN. So welcome to our second webinar. Today, we will be talking about detecting and managing wildlife diseases. Over the last 60 years, 43% of human emerging infectious diseases had wildlife origins. And as we know now, the COVID-19 pandemic has made this a very relevant issue. One of the outcomes of the pandemic was that it put a spotlight on the risk of disease transfer between animals and humans. Media around the world have placed this at the very center of their reporting for nearly 2 years now, and it has received global attention. We know now the real life impact an event like this can have on human health, our well-being, and our economy. And as wildlife experts, we know that this is one of the many diseases that could potentially transfer from animals to humans. And we're also not the only ones at risk. These diseases also pose a major threat to the survival of many threatened species. And this risk is only going to keep increasing with habitat fragmentation, with poaching, and as we increase the proximity between humans and wildlife. So basically, the more contact we have with each other, the closer we are with nature, the higher the risks. But the good news here is that we do have the tools to prevent this from happening. And this is where the management of wildlife diseases comes in. Of course, it's a complicated process, but we have the power to give the necessary tools to conservation organizations, communities, and also other stakeholders so they can improve disease management. These are crucial steps if we want to protect biodiversity and human health from future threats. I mean, as you might know, the IUCN Save Our Species program and the Integrated Tiger Habitat Conservation Program are grant-making mechanisms that focus on the conservation of threatened species. This means that we have access to unique insights from many project sites across the world. And this data and information is, of course, of great use for us, for our organization, but it can also help you. And we wanted to create these spaces so that we could share our own experiences with each other, learn from each other, and hopefully give you the tools to improve your own conservation activities. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you want in the chat. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce you to our host, Dr. Tiggy Grillo, who is co-chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Health Specialist Group and Chief Operating Officer and National Coordinator at Wildlife Health Australia. So Tiggy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. It's a fabulous event to be co-hosting and moderating this evening. We have an amazing range of speakers today, and it's an absolute pleasure. We look forward to their input. I would like to open the session with a bit of a setting the scene and providing you with some information. So first we'll go over the agenda. Sorry, I'll just go back to the last slide. For the agenda, we have some wonderful speakers, essentially a number of personal experiences that our grantees will be providing experiences on. Many of them are very experienced wildlife health professionals, and I'm really looking forward to their presentations. We also have the pleasure of having a number of our wildlife health specialist group members also on the group this evening, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the first session, and then also at the end of the second session. We'll also have a longer period of time for some in-depth Q&A towards the end of the session. So if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll be taking those. We'll hope to answer as many questions as possible. So yeah, we'd love to hear about what you would like to hear about and have a bit of a dialogue. So I'm going to set the scene this evening. I'd like to just first acknowledge the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, plants, and wildlife where I'm based. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you are living and learning and working from today. I pay respects to elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. This week in Australia, it's National Reconciliation Week, so particularly important for our First Nations people. So to set the scene, I think we're all aware that the environment, wildlife, human health are all interconnected. We've seen many of these diagrams before, and over the last 2 years, I think many have become very aware how connected we are and how important the biodiversity is, how essential it is for our healthy environment, and that's essential for the health of people and our livelihoods. Wildlife health in particular is important, and monitoring it can provide an early warning of disturbed environments and potential risks of emerging infections that can impact on human health and the economy. Wildlife declines can also have a wide range of significant consequences, some of which we might hear about today. And those impacts could include impacts on pollination or pest control, food chains, soil productivity and livelihoods of people. And many can have impacts on the conservation gains that we've done through our work. Disease can have many threats, both threats to wildlife, those, for example, like avian flu, which we think is predominantly something that impacts poultry, can impact wild species themselves, and we've seen that in the last year. Wildlife diseases can also impact on livestock and the economy. It has risks to public health, and some of those risks to public health can actually lead to risks of negative perceptions on wildlife. And these are things that none of us really want to see. Wildlife disease can also threaten endangered wild animal populations and ecosystems, and having cascade ecological impacts that we can't foresee when we first discover a new disease. Diseases emerge through a variety of factors, and some of these are very complex in why they spill over and then become localized and move around the planet. Often disease emergence is associated with human activities, and many of the drivers are not understood. But understanding the drivers can inform management actions, and that's one of the reasons why we're here today. So for example, land use change can result in changes to host pathogen dynamics, and that can lead to new diseases emerging. We also know that climate change will potentially force new animal encounters, and some recent work was published on this. And climate change will have other many impacts beyond what we can see today. And we've heard a lot over the last couple of years about wildlife trade and consumption of wildlife and the potential that that might have in relation to emerging disease. So I wanted to just present one diagram, and this is what we call the invasion curve here in Australia. And it really highlights that prevention is really critical and a cost-effective approach to response. Catching something early, detecting something early means that we can respond to that quickly. And so therefore, disease monitoring and detection can provide early warning. If we can prevent the drivers of emergence and detect things early, will be a much better approach to management of disease events. Understanding host pathogen dynamics is also critical to underpinning successful intervention strategies. And for wildlife, many of these host pathogen dynamics are unknown. So understanding those or building knowledge to understand these is really, really important. Wildlife disease management, one of the reasons why we're here today, can be informed by many things. And some of those things include monitoring and disease investigation and undertaking risk assessments to inform how we want to manage those risks. And if you're not aware of these guidelines, I'd certainly point you to them because they're a fantastic resource and are complemented by a manual. Successful wildlife disease management also includes coordination, collaboration, and communication. And we'll hear a little bit more about this later in our presentations. And today we're here to talk about wildlife disease management and detection from our grantees. And one of the key things to successful wildlife management in the future is relying on sharing success stories. And that's what we're here to do today, but you can also do that by contributing to the Panorama Solutions for the Healthy Planet. And I'd like to just point you to that website after this session. Take a look. There's some fantastic success stories already there. And if you have one that you want to share, I encourage you to contribute. So The next session, we'll be hearing from our grantees in the field and some personal experiences that they've undertaken. I'll introduce all three of them, and then we'll hear from each. At the end of all of their presentations, we'll take some questions dependent on time. If not, we'll go to after our final speakers and then take all the questions. So in panel one, we're very fortunate to have three amazing experts in the field. Dr. Matthew Linkie is the Deputy Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society Indonesia Programme. Dr. Chris Foggin, a wildlife veterinarian from Victoria Falls Wildlife Trust, and Steffen Zuther, a research fellow from the Frankfurt Zoological Society and Association Conservation of Biodiversity of Kazakhstan. They will provide a wide range of experiences on what they have seen in the field, and we look forward to your presentations. So I'll first go to Matthew for your presentation this evening.
Great, thank you, Tiggy, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So if we could go to the next slide. So we're currently facing three major nature-related crises: biodiversity loss, climate change, pandemics, or COVID-19. They're all closely connected. So deforestation, for example, brings people, livestock, wildlife into closer contact under stress conditions as well. And this greatly increases the likelihood of emerging infectious disease or EID spillovers. And over the past decades, what we've seen is there's been an increase in these EID events, especially the zoonotic ones originating in wildlife. And so around a similar time that we had the emergence of COVID-19, another EID has spread from Europe to Asia, and with devastating consequences. Next slide. So African swine fever, it's a virulent emerging infectious disease. It's completely harmless to humans, but it's almost certainly guaranteed to cause fatality in pigs, so Suscrofa. And since 2019, it's rapidly spread across Asia, enabled by high pig densities, domestic pig rearing, widespread trade routes linked to high levels of pork consumption. And what we're seeing now, as in Europe, it may well become endemic in Asia. And this is really important because African swine fever's impact has been devastating, and it may have long-term consequences. So next slide. So far, it's killed hundreds of millions of pigs, and a lot of these are domestic pigs, and this is either through infection or it could be through preventive culling measures. It's cost the pork industry hundreds of billions of dollars, and it led to a reduction in protein consumption in many countries as well. But perhaps for us, worryingly, it's for Asia's 11 endemic pig species. We've seen the virus jump from the domestic pig to wild boar, both Suscrofa species, but we've also seen it jump to bearded pigs, so Sus babatus, a different species, to the Philippines warty pig, so Sus philippensis. And this has led to die-offs in the forest. Now, for two of the critically endangered pig species that we have in Asia, so the pygmy hog, the Visayan warty hog in the Philippines, and the pygmy hog in India, these populations in the wild number in the hundreds of individuals, not thousands or 10,000s, and maybe just in one population in the wild. And so you could see the high risk and the possibility for devastating consequences there as well. So next slide. And it's not just about the loss of the pigs, it's what may then happen and triggering these trophic cascades for plant communities or for apex predators, and the livelihoods of millions of people as well. And so pigs are seed dispersers, they're also seed predators, and so their loss may affect forest structure, forest composition, and also regeneration. Wild boar in particular, they're a principal prey species for populations of tigers or Javan leopards or Komodo dragons, all highly threatened apex predators. And so perhaps the loss of this major food resource may lead to increases in human carnivore conflicts, such as tigers coming out of the forest and attacking livestock such as goats or buffaloes, or even coming into closer contact with people as well who live in these farming communities. And there's also additional economic and cultural impacts that may be caused by this. It may be on impacts on rural communities through the loss of an important protein source for millions of people, such as the Dayaks in Borneo who hunt wild boar, or indigenous communities in Papua who hunt wild boar as well. And so you're recognizing the importance of maintaining healthy wildlife populations and ecosystems, but also the devastating and the profound impacts that a viral disease like African swine fever can have. The IUCN, FAO, and OIE, so the World Organization for Animal Health, developed a joint communique. Next slide, please. And so what this does, it calls for a multi-partner or multi-agency organization response to addressing African swine fever, because it's a health issue, it's a livelihood issue, an economic issue. It's also a biodiversity conservation issue as well. And no one organization can tackle this alone. It requires high levels of coordination and communication amongst different ministries that might not traditionally work together. And it requires this unified response. And that's going to include policy reforms as well. And I guess encouragingly, what we are seeing is countries like Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia are beginning to make these types of reforms. And it's also really important as part of the solution that we start to develop these SOPs or guidelines on how to respond. So surveillance in forest landscapes, so we can detect the disease if it emerges or when it emerges. And so that might be the identification of carcasses where we have these mass pig die-offs. And it's critically important at that point to then test to see whether that is African swine fever causing that. And if so, that there's then the correct disposal of the carcasses, so incineration or through putting the carcasses in body bags, burying them deep underground. The key point there being is that you can't then have reinfection, because the virus could last 2 months in a wild boar carcass. It may then get spread across the forest by scavengers, other predators, like monitor lizards or some of the mesopredators such as civets, and then just go on to reinfect other pigs within the landscape as well. And so we're seeing good action, good steps being taken here by the governments in Malaysia, so Sarawak, for example, and also across Indonesia as well. And it's really key to be thinking about what are the strict biosecurity measures that need to be introduced and put into place. And so I think here we've got a nice example from up in Assam in India. So the Indian Forest Department working with NGOs like Aranak and the Durrell Institute and others with the pygmy hog conservation program. And so what they've done in the captive breeding center of these pygmy hogs that they release into the wild is they put in these strict measures. So, for example, restricted access to their facilities, disinfecting people or vehicles or food that's coming in. And this is all essential, also limiting essential personnel only to come into these facilities. But what you can see there is just the sheer amount of effort, also the resources, including funding, that has to go into trying to control and prevent the further transmission of African swine fever. And it just really underscores the important point that what we need to do is really prevent the pandemic at source if we're going to really get ahead of the curve on this one. So just click to the next point. And so this is now African swine fever is in Asia. It hasn't been before. It's already in Europe and it's endemic, and it just now goes through these boom bust cycles of the pig populations. But there you're just dealing with suscrofrans and wild boar. But here in Asia, we have the 11 wild pig species. And so how we then tackle and contain and hopefully try and prevent the further transmission of the disease in the future is very much an open question for discussion right now, because there isn't a vaccine that's currently available. There are ones that are being trialed and developed, but how that would work in reality in vaccinating populations of wild pigs, we don't know. But what we need to do right now is make sure that we're containing it as best we can. So thank you for your time, and happy to answer questions later on.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It was great because you talked to many of the points that I raised earlier in much more detail. and certainly highlighted some of the key things that we need to consider moving forward with some of these diseases that can impact on native species in areas and regions. Thank you, Matthew. We'd like to introduce next Dr. Chris Foggin, and he'll be talking to us about elephants, and really looking forward to this presentation and some of the lessons you've learned, Chris.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, this is a very parochial talk, I'm afraid. Just by way of orientation, the first slide shows the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, which has probably more than half the remaining African savanna elephant. And then on the top left is the northwestern corner of Zimbabwe and Victoria Falls area, which is where we're situated. And though on the right are some of the scenes that we're faced with in dealing with elephant. Next slide. I think can just bring all the points up and then we'll deal with them. Yeah, keep going. Okay. So we have to deal with quite a few elephant carcasses, and poaching is a major threat in this part of the world for the ivory. And that's one of the main causes of mortality. But we also have other human activity, non-malicious, causing mortality. We have infectious disease. We have the possibility of natural poisoning of elephant and other natural causes. And then when you're faced with having to do a post-mortem on an elephant, which is quite a task, you know, and it's impossible to keep yourself free of getting contaminated, or almost impossible. Are you going to contaminate yourself or risk other people? And if you don't do a post-mortem, you may miss an important disease issue or a crime scene. Next slide. I think just flip down the whole lot, thanks. Okay, so some of the disease and natural causes that we have of elephant in this part of the world is anthrax. We've more recently had a type of hemorrhagic septicemia caused by a member of the Pastorella group, which I'll talk a bit more about. Elephant myocarditis virus, which is associated with rodent explosions. The Botswanans have diagnosed cyanotoxicosis, and plant toxins are also a possibility. We have a massive population of elephants here, 40,000 within Zimbabwe, in our section of Zimbabwe. And these often are faced with climatic problems and drought, and they become trapped in mud. There's a lot of trauma between them, and wounds get infected and they die from septicemia. And then we have the poaching problems. Most of them are shot, but there is a lot of the use of cyanide to poison elephants. It's very effective and very easy to obtain, but more about that later. We've also had pesticide poisoning, particularly aldicarb and carbofuran, and then snaring, which is particularly vicious on the elephant, and they can take a very long time to die, and we can take many of those snares off. And there's train and vehicle accidents that are also killing our elephant. Next slide. Okay, so one of the main problems we have is to try and decide whether we're dealing with a crime scene or whether we're dealing with a natural cause. And so some of the pointers that we use in the field to decide whether it's poaching or poisoning as against disease. Often we'll find a number of elephant dead very close together. The carcasses will be in the same stage of decomposition. Often the ivory, if we're dealing with rhino, the horn is removed, but sometimes elephants are shot and the poachers don't find them, or they're poisoned and the poachers don't find them. It can be very difficult to find bullet holes, and if you get more than one species dead in a small area, that is a particular indication that we're dealing with poisoning. particularly if those animals are close to small water bodies or natural salt licks. Poison baits may be present, and you may see some animals with neurological signs. And intelligence of poachers' activity in the region is very important as well. Next slide. Okay, and then looking or pointers to natural cause of disease. The carcasses are normally more spread out. The deaths occur over a longer time period. The carcasses are in different stages of decomposition. The ivory is normally intact, but poachers can remove ivory from animals that have died naturally. Bullet holes may be present, but often they're difficult to find. Usually with a wildlife disease or an elephant disease, we're dealing with the same species of the anthrax, which we have in this area, will kill a number of different species. Dead animals that are dying close to the larger water bodies, as against very small water bodies that can be easily poisoned, is another indication. Particularly if that water is showing an indication of cyanobacteria being present, no baits, and some of your initial signs are fairly specific to diseases, and local information on what diseases are occurring in the area and knowledge of rodent explosions is important. Next slide. Yeah, just some one back. Yeah, thanks. One health considerations. A lot of artificial water points have been put in to increase the tourist viewing of elephant, and this has led to some major problems in terms of overabundance of elephant and stress and nutritional problems. The water points are a target for poachers. We do have droughts, which seem to be increasing, and that can lead to greater incidence of infectious disease. And also in the case of Botswana, can cause the likelihood of cyanotoxins being present in the small seasonal ephemeral water points. We do have problems with some zoonotic diseases. TB has been recorded in elephant in Zimbabwe, but it's mainly anthrax and Pasteurella. Where toxins are used to kill elephant, these pose a particular danger to people, which I'll show in a couple of photographs. And there is a possibility of catastrophic disease outbreaks. And poisoning has severely impacted our vulture population. Next slide. Okay, very quickly, a couple of years ago, we had an outbreak of infectious disease. And it was not a lot of animals, but it was quite dramatic the way it occurred. It was mostly young animals. It occurred at the end of two poor rainy seasons, and it followed that Botswana mortality that was gained a lot of international publicity. The animals had clearly died suddenly. We opened them up. They had swollen livers and spleens and limited hemorrhage. And microscopically, we saw microabscessation of the liver, spleen, lung, bacterial emboli in the spleen and other organs, and blood smears showed some Pasteurella-like organisms. Initial culture indicated Pasteurella multicida, but DNA sequencing indicated that it wasn't in fact, but it was a close relative. And going back and looking at histopathology of mortality as far back as 4 or 5 years ago, we actually have been seeing this for a number of years. And we don't know at this stage if it's a novel infection or if it's a commensal and a stress-precipitated bacteremia, septicemia, and possibility of severe mortality and severe drought from this disease exists. Next slide. Okay, just some photographs of this particular condition. Top left, mostly immature animals. They were lying either sternal or lateral. Swollen, very congested liver. Histopathology on the right, liver microabscesses with bacteria. Quite dramatic bacterial emboli in the brain and Pasteurella-like organisms in some of the blood smears. Next slide. Moving on to the general sort of diagnostic gallery that we're faced with. Sometimes we're faced with carcasses where you can get very little out of it. Next slide. Cyanide poisoning is a particular problem we face and poses severe threats to our elephant and to some extent our rhino. What you can see is different species dead at small water points. A number of carcasses close to a natural salt lick on the top right there, and often other species present. That's salt laced with cyanide that has killed that sandgrouse. Next slide. Okay, just some more cyanide. It's very often mixed with salt. Top right, what the poachers do is to put cyanide in oranges, which poses a great threat to humans who find these oranges as well. And these are laid along elephant paths, and we have to do a rapid cyanide field test to determine if cyanide is present. Next slide. Also going on poisoning, one of the pointers is that elephants often carry a number of insect larvae, bots in their stomach, and these are killed by pesticides and cyanide. Next slide. I mentioned catastrophic effect on vultures. This is a scene I had to go to in Botswana a few years back, where we lost over 500 vultures. The poachers were camped at a waterhole, were shooting elephants at leisure, and then lacing the carcasses with carbofuran to avoid detection. Just on the bottom right there, sometimes live vultures can get trapped in elephant carcasses. Next slide. Anthrax often gives fairly typical appearance, and all we do is to take blood smears, but sometimes they die sternly. You can go on to the next one. Easy to diagnose on blood smears, but you can often tell from the way the elephant are lying and the appearance of the carcass in the field. Next slide. Okay, bullet holes pose a particular problem. We obviously have to use metal detectors. You don't always find them, but poaching by gunshot is quite common, and again, a major threat to elephant. And it's amazing how good the poachers are, and sometimes how poor the law enforcement is in getting behind the poachers. Next slide. That's a scene out of Botswana with the possibility of cyanotoxicosis killing elephant, and they lost some hundreds of elephant. Next slide. I think this is the last one. And we have a particularly poisonous plant that is widespread in this part of the world. We see elephants eating it. We don't know what effect it has on elephant, but it's extremely toxic to livestock. And the livestock learn to avoid it, and elephants seem to eat it quite happily. But we don't know if they do subsequently die when they drink water, or some of them do. Next slide. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a wonderful expose of the challenges of trying to work out why elephants have died, and highlights all the different potential causes of mortalities and the complexities in that investigation. So I'm sure there'll hopefully be some questions for you in the chat later on that we can explore that further. So thank you for that overview. Next up, we have a speaker from Frankfurt Zoological Society, and we'll be talking around his work in Kazakhstan. I'd like to welcome Steffen Zuther to present on work in Kazakhstan. So welcome, Chris. Welcome, Steffen. I can't hear you, Steffen. Hopefully we can hear you. I can see you. That's a bonus.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now. Fantastic.
That's better.
Yeah,
Okay,
fantastic.
yeah. Thank you, Tiggy. Hello, everyone. With this presentation, I'm going to show a case study on Saiga antelopes in Kazakhstan and hope to underline some of the aspects the other speakers have made in their presentations. Next slide, please. So we have a large conservation initiative in Kazakhstan, the Altandala Conservation Initiative, which is also meant for the long term. We have started back in 2005 with the main idea. And the project area you can see in the map on the left bottom side of this slide. The red line shows the main area where we started to work, which is the formerly largest population of the Saiga antelope in Kazakhstan. The area size is about the size of France. And in this initiative, we use an ecosystem approach, looking at various aspects of the ecosystems. But the key species, or one of the key species, is the Saiga antelope. And as it's critically endangered, it has been in the focus of our activities quite a lot. As you can see on the graph on the right bottom side, we managed through our project and through government activities to raise the population quite a lot. It started growing immediately when we started, basically, and now, yeah, as you can see, grew very, very well. So the project was quite successful at the beginning, but we didn't have any wildlife health issues included in the project at the very beginning. So next slide, please. But we, looks a bit different than I prepared it, but anyway. But we had to deal with wildlife health issues quite soon. So already in May 2010, there was a mass die-off of Saiga antelope in Western Kazakhstan, so a different population, not related to our project directly, but still there was an issue with the species. And the problem at that time was that there was actually nobody prepared for it. It was a big surprise, as such thing has never happened for many, many years. It was only known from Soviet time, so quite a long time ago. The reaction on that was rather slow. There were no particularly educated wildlife veterinarians available. And that's why the conclusion on the cause was not really well made, or was not really possible. So what was the consequence was that there was a retrospective investigation later on the causes of this die-off, with recommendations for the future work of the wildlife authorities in Kazakhstan. But the government funded a monitoring and research program in Kazakhstan, which we supported as NGO, to especially get people to the field and take samples from Saiga to get a health monitoring running. The FAO funded training for wildlife health agencies in Kazakhstan, and a lot of international corporations actually evolved. And wildlife health experts came, and students actually came to Kazakhstan and worked there in the following years after 2010. But eventually the funding, the government funding, ended at some point, and the activities slowed down a bit. But then something else happened in central Kazakhstan. Next slide, please. It was this big catastrophe, which you have probably heard of, 2015, when in this population where we worked, and which has grown a lot in the years when we worked there, suddenly most of the animals died during the calving in May. Next slide, please. So just to bring you all on the same page, the main facts of this die-off: about 200,000 animals, or even more than that, died just during 2-3 weeks in May 2015. This is about 2/3 of the world population at that time. the mortality in these aggregations during calving time was about 100%. And at one site, this die-off lasted about a week to 10 days, and then all the animals were dead. Both adult animals died as well as calves, which probably got infected through milk. And this die-off was distributed really across the whole range of the bedbug dala population, across various sites quite far away from each other. And the conclusion was, after a long and intensive investigation of this case, that hemorrhagic septicemia was this phenomenon killing all the animals caused by the bacterium Pastorella multocida serotype B. And this was, for everyone, a big catastrophe, which definitely calls for changes. And some of these changes still have not been implemented. Next slide, please. So the consequences from this die-off were that our project, the Alten Dala Conservation Initiative, focused not only anymore on one population, Kazakhstan, but on all 3 Saiga populations in the country. The partnership was broadened, not only including the Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity of Kazakhstan, ACBK, as the main implementing organization, and the Government Committee for Forestry and Wildlife, but also Fauna and Flora International as a new international organization, then Frankfurt Zoological Society and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. A very close cooperation evolved with veterinarian institutes in Kazakhstan, even closer than before. And we hosted quite a few international experts for many years, and students coming to Kazakhstan, helping with the field work, not only taking usual samples, but also looking at other aspects around Saiga, at domestic livestock and other issues. So to really see the whole picture around this incident. And we actually used every opportunity we had whenever dealing with animals to take samples, to bring them to the lab and do further analysis to understand what actually had happened and to get a better understanding of what was the cause. Next slide, please. ACBK has pushed for a finalization of standard operating procedures, which had been initiated actually before this disease outbreak. And these standard operating procedures can help to make the reaction on disease outbreaks in Saiga or other wildlife better, faster and more efficient. This document also contains a guideline for rangers, for instance, working in the field, who observe Saiga carcasses or other wildlife, and what to do then in this case, what data to collect and how to report to their main office. It contains recommendations for the establishment of a rapid response unit for disease outbreaks in wildlife, guidelines for health monitoring and field sampling, and more. I won't go into detail more now during this presentation, but you can find the document on the CMS website in the Saiga documents, basically. The only problem with this is that political will and governmental funding is needed to implement all of this, and this is still at the moment lacking in Kazakhstan. Next slide, please. And further consequences were related to the protection of Saiga from poaching. There was quite some significant improvement of the anti-poaching work in Kazakhstan after this die-off, because it, as we can't do anything really against this disease outbreak directly, as it's related to weather conditions in a certain year. The idea was to bring the populations at a very high level in order to make them resilient to such catastrophes. And the government has spent quite a lot of money to improve the equipment, mainly of rangers, which you can see there on the photo at the bottom. Changes in the legislation have been made to improve Saiga protection. And the government actually has developed a roadmap of further activities for Saiga research and conservation and health monitoring. But unfortunately, this got never funded. So this is what happened after the die-off in Kazakhstan, but something else happened with Saiga in Mongolia. Next slide, please. A different problem in the winter in year 2016-17, there was a PPR outbreak in Mongolia, which caused the loss of 80% of the Mongolian subspecies of Saiga. Only a little bit more than 5,000 individuals remained by April 2018, and the population is still recovering from that. So there was a spillover from livestock to wildlife, and such spillover can have devastating effects when entering a naive population like Saiga in Mongolia. We actually had a PPR outbreak as well in Kazakhstan, in livestock at the southern border of the country, so probably coming from Kyrgyzstan. But spillover to wildlife, fortunately, has been avoided through a fast reaction by the authorities. So it has been quickly detected that it was PPR virus, and large-scale vaccination program had been started. So it has not been spread further in the country. Please, on the next slide, you can see that on the map. The red regions there in the south of Kazakhstan, that were the areas where the infection, the outbreaks took place of PPR. And the light green, again, in central Kazakhstan, is the closest Saiga population. So there was still some distance, but it could have also affected Saiga in Kazakhstan. So yeah, next slide. Thank you. So what we learned from all that, just to summarize the main points, is that diseases need to be taken into account in conservation projects from the start, which we have not done, but now it's an integral part of our work in Kazakhstan. It's important to not put all eggs in one basket and to broaden the approach to make it more resilient. Disease surveillance is very crucial in wildlife. Continuously, whenever possible, take samples and get knowledge about what's going on in the wildlife population, but also particularly at key moments in the species life cycle, if there are such key moments like the calving time in Saiga, when there are other stress factors affecting the species. Veterinarians need to be trained to work with wildlife. There are still shortcomings in Kazakhstan, but the situation has improved actually a lot. Then it's advantages to adopt standard operating procedures like we have them in Kazakhstan, which can really help to improve the reaction on disease outbreaks in wildlife, also through setting up a rapid response unit. Intense veterinary care is also needed for domestic animals at the range of wildlife species of conservation concern, which is in line with the One Health approach, which has been mentioned before in the other presentations. Vaccinations among domestic livestock should take into account the needs of wildlife species living in the area. So vaccination programs might to be adapted accordingly. And it's important to be careful with introductions of wild or domestic species to a distribution area of endangered wildlife species, let's say, because that can mean that it brings to the area also other diseases which have not been there before. With PPR, it's very important, especially the transport of domestic livestock from one country to another. And it's really, really important to not underestimate the importance of wildlife health issues for wildlife conservation, as we have learned the hard way in Kazakhstan, actually. That's the main points I wanted to make. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Wonderful presentation and a great list of lessons learned there, and hopefully that might stimulate some additional questions from our audience. We have one question came through specifically aimed at yourself, was around PPR, but I think you answered the question to that in relation to issues relating to PPR in Kazakhstan. But I was wondering, actually, I wanted to ask all three of our panel members. We heard from Stefan about some of the lessons learnt, but one thing that sort of resonated through everybody's presentations was the need to collaborate and work with others. And I wondered if you maybe go to each one of you and ask sort of, what are your, how do you go about doing this, and what are some of the success stories, and how could you make relationships work moving forward to try and get those maintained and to effectively look into some of these issues in the field? So maybe go to Matthew first to answer that question.
Thanks, Tiggy. Sure. So I guess when we're talking about African swine fever, for example, I work for WCS. We partner with the Indonesian Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and we start talking to them about this. I think what we need to remember is they have a whole range of other priorities and other pressing issues that they're working on as well, with biodiversity conservation, forest conservation, things like that. And so here we are now introducing something that potentially is quite catastrophic, requires a swift response, but also requires allocating resources. And one of the key resources is their time as well. And so I think this is where the partnership become really important, in terms of it's not for a single ministry or a single agency to address this. We all have to work together. And so what's worked well in Indonesia is we have the Sumatran Tiger Forum called Harimau Kita. Essentially, they're the voice of the NGOs and other interested parties working on Sumatran tiger issues. And so they've been very prominent in engaging with the government. They've been engaging with FAO. So FAO regionally has been involved, FAO within Indonesia. And you can see there how we start to develop the same understanding of the issue, where the outbreaks are, also what we don't know, where outbreaks may be, but we're having anecdotes that we're picking up on. What some of the sensible measures are. The joint communique that we developed outlines some of those in terms of just the surveillance and the testing and the carcass disposal to stop the reinfection. And then how we can then start to, through our partnerships in these landscapes where the wild boar are, where the tigers are, where perhaps the bearded pigs are and other species, what we can then do through those partnerships. And so I think that's worked really well in Indonesia. I think what's key with all of this is that you do have the government as the in-country authority leading on this as well, and then we're all then supporting with our own resources, be it time, money, expertise, whatever, to work that way.
That's great, thank you, Matthew. Stefan, do you have anything to add in terms of relationship building and maintaining those relationships?
Yeah, for us, it has been crucial really to get external expertise to Kazakhstan, to our project, because we didn't have any veterinarian experience at all in our team. I think yeah, the main cooperating partner for us was the Royal Veterinary College in London, and other experts, scientists who partly even have worked with Saiga before and then came back to work on this health issue. I think the crucial thing here is that the government is also positive about it, that external expertise comes in, and that they respect that there are really experts coming from other countries and welcome their advice and recommendations, so that this can really have an impact. And that was the case in Kazakhstan, and helped us a lot in this case. So for many years, actually, people came to us and helped with field work, but also really worked as advisors, partly for the government, especially after this die-off in 2015. And that was extremely helpful.
Great, thanks, Stefan. And I might go to Chris. Do you have any lessons learned? I know you work for the Department of Veterinary Services in Zimbabwe. but you must have to collaborate with others. Do you have any lessons learned in terms of maintaining those collaborations?
Yes, well, certainly when we had the elephant posturilla type disease, we have very limited diagnostic capacity in the whole country. And so we're quite dependent on collaborating with other laboratories with greater resources. We can do so much here, but not more. In this case, it proved easy in one respect to send samples to the UK, and extremely difficult to send them to South Africa, to the extent that it took us nearly 6 weeks to get permits to send bacteriological samples to South Africa. So our problems are, while there's great willingness of other laboratories in particular to collaborate, there's great difficulty logistically and so bureaucratically in moving samples around rapidly. And this is an ongoing problem. I think everybody experiences it. We seem to have no answers to it. The country authorities require the permits, and there's no quick way around this. And it can be a game changer in trying to come to accurate diagnoses quickly.
Yeah, that's a real challenge, I think, globally, and certainly, especially when you're wanting to utilize expertise. I think that was certainly a case for the saga antelopes as well. We have lots of questions coming through in our session. I just want to flag to those of you who have either raised your hand or want to ask to actually speak. We're unable to unmute the participants this evening. So if you do have a comment or a question, if you can please pop it in the chat, and we'll moderate those questions and comments so we can try and get through as many as possible. So I do have a question here, and this might, maybe I can get one of our speakers to raise their hands who wants to answer this first. So given some cases presented here start with a spillover from domestic species, so livestock species, how can we encourage stakeholders to report early cases? Assuming, in brackets, it says, assuming people are losing livelihoods and may be concerned with repercussions of reporting. Matthew.
Sure. I mean, this is a really key one for African swine fever. We have to encourage this reporting. You look at where the 11 wild pig species are in Asia. It's such a vast area that it covers that we're not going to be able to comprehensively monitor these areas. And so what we can do where we're working in our landscape, so where you might have field teams, community outreach teams, human wildlife conflict mitigation teams who are working with communities at the forest edge, they can certainly be tracking that, and that's a great way through those partnerships just to raise awareness, to encourage the community partners to report. And I wouldn't be worried about repercussions there, because in many ways it is something where they're helping you, you'll be helping them as well. Where we don't have that widespread coverage, what we've found particularly helpful has been just local media reports. You know, you have journalists who are on the ground, they have wide networks, they're picking up on stories. And so we've been mapping out through media monitoring where potential outbreaks are, and then going to those areas with partners who we know work in those landscapes, and then cross-checking with them to try and verify these reports. And that certainly provided a lot more information than we would have got otherwise. So that's been a key resource.
Thank you, Matt. That's a great answer. Stefan or Chris, do you have any comments in relation to that question? I'll repeat it.
I can make a quick comment.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay. In that the lack of knowledge in subsistent farmers on the significance of reporting disease is a real problem, and only education, which takes a long time, can really assist with this. Livestock that die are normally eaten or sold to be eaten elsewhere, which has led to quite a number of human cases of anthrax, for instance. And it's difficult to make people aware of the dangers of zoonotic disease. And without education, I don't think we're going to make much progress on that.
Thanks, Chris. That's really useful. I think absolutely education is key. And some of the recommendations from Matthew were fantastic too. Stefan, did you have anything to add?
I just agree with Chris that education of livestock keepers is very important, but requires quite some efforts. It's also important to work with local veterinarians, so who might not be aware of diseases like PPR coming in, and it's important to really train them regularly to make them aware of such things, and that they can then report it. Actually, then it might work easier, because usually livestock keepers, if they have problems with disease in their animals, they would call for a veterinarian, but he also needs to understand what he sees there.
Thank you. That's great. And we had a comment quickly. Just UNICEF has some lovely films to educate livestock keepers and the public. So thank you to Ute Ellenberger for that comment in the chat. We do have time, some flexibility today, and we have had a few questions come through. So there are a couple more questions I wanted to ask to our panel of grantees. There was one question here. For previous years, most of our rangers suffered from anthrax and caused when scouts got into contact with elephant flesh while removing trophies. Is there any way that helps them know whether the animal is infected before any action? I think this one's directed at you, Chris.
In our situation, we don't have sort of bedside tests for anthrax. However, knowledge that anthrax is occurring in the area and the attitude of elephant when they die of anthrax with a very stiff-legged appearance, which you can get with other decomposition causes as well, is quite a good pointer. We can get a blood smear result very quickly, or a PCR result pretty quickly, but it does need generally going back to the lab. We don't often take microscopes into the field. Yeah, I suppose that's about all I can say. Our Department of or Agency of Parks and Wildlife always will remove tusks, usually without any protection. And it's amazing how few cases of anthrax we get from that. I don't seem to be able to stop them doing it, but I do advise them to spray the tusk with a very strong chlorine disinfectant, and a lot of these tusks will then go into the main ivory store in Harare.
Thanks, Chris, for answering that question. And certainly there are many diseases people should be aware of when handling dead wildlife, and there are many precautions that you can take. There's some good links to potential resources as well within the chat, so for people to have a look at the chat as well. There was one question here, and I'm not sure, again, this might be one for you, Chris. It's around bushmeat consumption and poor meat hygiene. I guess this could probably actually be one for all of our speakers. There was a question about how much bushmeat consumption and poor meat hygiene can facilitate disease spread. Wondering if any of you would like to answer that one. It's certainly a hot topic. Matt.
Well,
Matthew.
I can kick off if you like.
Go for it, Chris, and then we'll go to Matthew.
Okay, all right. I'm sure others have got better points than me, but anthrax is a particular problem, and elephant and hippo in particular tend to be cut up and sold if they're found dead. It's a major problem. We get a lot of poaching by snaring as well. That bushmeat finds its way, it almost becomes a commercial business, in fact, around Victoria Falls in particular, and that meat is sold without any, obviously, without any hygiene measures being put in place. So it's a major problem, and we don't have any particular answers. Again, education is very important, but you know, when you're dealing with a population that is pretty poverty stricken, it's very difficult to get these messages across. And fortunately, we haven't turned up any horrible viruses this way, but that happens elsewhere.
Thanks, Chris, for your answer. Matthew.
Well, I think, you know, when you look at the origins of COVID-19, if you look at some of the past EID outbreaks of zoonotic origins, so thinking about SARS, civets, you know, where you have these wild meat markets, or where you have live animals in particular, you know, these animals under very stressed conditions, their immune systems will be weakened, they'll be mixed with other animals. That gives the opportunity for the jump from the virus, or the EID from one species to another, then can jump onto humans and mutate along the way. So I think it's really important. It's not just about making the markets more hygienic. That's not going to resolve the issue here. The fundamental issue is that these animals are in trade, and they're coming into close contact with people, and they're all mixing together in a very unnatural environment. And so that just increases the likelihood of you know, the next EID emerging. And so we have to be really careful with these wildlife markets. So there have been calls for closing the markets down. Maybe that's not practical in some countries, but I think it goes way beyond in terms of just the hygiene as well. But the hygiene is obviously part of a solution, but you know, is not going to be the main part.
And certainly understanding those disease risks, education was raised as a potential opportunity to highlight some of the challenges and issues that can occur at that interface when people are handling animals. And risk assessments are another aspect. One of the things that was found recently in relation to a review of risks from bushmeat is that actual management strategies to stop spillovers or to stop issues relating to human health, the effectiveness of those haven't been measured as much. So quite a lot of the time we look for, you know, the pathogens or the potential emerging infectious disease that might be present in those species. But actually what's effective in terms of management of that and stopping the spillover events or the transmission events that might happen at those interfaces, for example, from bushmeat. And so that's something that could be certainly an avenue to explore further in this space, to try and understand better what's effective and what we can highlight as success stories in mitigating those issues. So there have been a few people posting in the chat some really good manuals in relation to from WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health. Many people might have remembered that it was previously called the OIE and has recently changed its name to WOA. So thank you for those who have flagged some of the training manuals that are available on the OIE, on the WOA website.